Hello. Today we have someone coming to us from Portland, Oregon. Welcome, Sariah. Happy to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome. We're excited to hear your story. It's been a long time coming. So how did you find the podcast and how are you wanting to tell your story? Why are you here?
No, I appreciate that. I think it through Instagram, I think I found you guys, and the only reason I think I found it because I think I guess coming out of the fog journey came later in life. And so once you get into that search for people like you, being able to hear other stories like your story, it allowed me to kind of find all these different resources and opportunities, whether they're podcasts or groups that I was able to find other adoptees and to be able to feel less alone in my story, as well as being able to know how to heal and how to advocate for adoptees like me as well. And so that's kind of what I think allowed me to find you guys and hear your different stories that you've listened to, as well as knowing that you guys are taking the time to find books as well. I think for adoptees to consider listening to or reading, and so I think those two elements have been very helpful, allowing me to find those opportunities to read books that help either help me understand myself or help me be able to share that with others who may not fully understand what it's like to be adopted.
What was
Right.
that sort of moment that made you go down the path and come out of the fog, as it were? You said
Yeah.
late, but you do not seem older than us. So,
No,
Um,
not that late.
so I'm 32 going on 33. But for me, I came out of the fog during COVID actually, which was kind of a very weird
mm,
feeling. Taking that time. And of course, as I go into my story, it kind of makes more sense just because I never felt the need to, or I never felt that it was a priority when I was younger, because other things took, I think, precedence over that. And so I think the big part was, just COVID and realizing that there were people who found blame of certain, groups of why COVID
Oh,
happened. And so that was a first for me where people would express, hey, you're the reason we have COVID. And I was like, I'm an
oh,
American. I don't know what you're talking
oh
about.
gosh.
And so I think that started opening up the door of like, okay, like there's something different about me than
yeah.
I might have, expected, even though, I grew up knowing that I was, different from everyone else as I'm the only adoptee in my family. And I'm a transracial adoptee. So it was very, evident that I was different, but I think because of the way I was raised, it was almost kind of whitewashed out of me to think about my race and
Hmm.
what that meant.
So, your parents didn't sort of keep your culture alive as when you were growing up?
I would say they did, I think, the minimum in the sense that for much of my life, the argument was that it was on me to make that decision if I wanted it or not. So if I didn't ask, then it wasn't my, right? It wasn't
Mm,
in their intention to follow through with that. And
that's a
so
lot to place on a young child.
It is.
it is. And then of course too, I think the way I grew up with my story as well is there's a lot of fear based on what it meant to be Asian, what it meant to be Chinese. And so it was almost
Yeah.
terrifying to know what that meant for myself as I grew up with the stories of what the government was like or what the orphanage was like. And so these different factors definitely made me less appreciative of what it meant to
Hmm.
be Chinese and what it meant to be, of that heritage.
Yeah. To dig into it would be a little bit scary because you don't know it's all cultural, right? We learned that in Angela Tucker's book. You're just hearing one side. You're not thinking of your whole heritage and the history of it all.
Mhm.
Well, how did,
What, so this was
yeah.
sort of during the scoop of Chinese
Mm-hmm.
adoptions of the 90s?
Yes, I was adopted in 1996.
Oh yeah.
Okay, wow. So
So,
that very much sort of
Mm-hmm.
the height of that.
mhm. But it was also interesting too, because it was also the transition where China, I think around the time I was adopted, you could choose, a child that you wanted to, adopt versus, I think around 1996, a little later, they transitioned like, hey, we're going to decide who your child is. We're going to decide what child you're going to get. So I was kind of that end era of making your own choice of choosing me as the adoptee for my
So your
family.
parents went to China and chose you.
Yeah, so my father worked for Honda at the time, and so they were previously in Japan, and by the time they had four boys,
Mm.
and then they moved to China so my dad could work there, and then my mother got pregnant with my sister,
So
and
four boys that were natural children?
yes, uh-huh,
Okay. And then a daughter?
mm-hmm,
So five biological children prior
correct.
to you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Keep going. And both your parents were white, I'm assuming.
Yes.
Okay.
So my parents were white. My father's family's from Ohio. My mother's side is from Massachusetts. And so yeah, so
Yeah. And
How
what
did
were
they
what,
come to adopt you?
yeah. So the story that I was told as a child was that during the time that my mother, had these four boys and my dad was working, she found someone within her church that was volunteering at the orphanage that I was at. And so she took that opportunity to say, hey, I want to volunteer and help out as well. And so she advised that when she came and she was volunteering, she noticed that there's something different about me than all the other children. And so it kind of sparked this, hey, maybe we could foster this child or, take care of this kid. Because I think initially they weren't thinking about adoption. They were just thinking about, helping out but then um, again, things were different back then because I think they were like, "Hey, we want to, foster this kid," and they said, "Sure, take her this weekend. Bring her back, on Monday, and it'll be fine." And I think during that weekend, my father had told my mom, like, "Hey, we can't do that again. Like, either we adopt this kid or you don't do that again because it's a lot." So it was very emotional for him to see kind of the condition that I was in. And I was 3, so I wasn't like a baby or anything like
oh,
that. I had already been in the
yeah.
orphanage for 3 years before I came there. So I looked like a 18-month-old, I was advised. And so that's kind of, I think that
Oh,
the trigger of, this kid, it needs help, and either we give them that full help or we can't do it. It's just so, the emotional toll for sure.
what was the orphanage? Why were you in the orphanage? Do you know?
Yeah, so from what I have in my records, I was abandoned at a month old,
Mhm.
um, in 1992, and then I was taken to the police station. I like to joke with people; it's the only time I've ever been in a police station. But
So far.
that they found me in that district, and so they're like, okay, this kid looks like a month old. What day is it? Okay, yeah, month. All right, and then they sent me to the Shanghai Children's Institute, and that's where I
Oh.
stayed for the next 3 years before I was adopted.
Do you have any memories from that?
That's a good question. It's a question I get a lot. For me, no. And I don't, and the part of me feels like that's a good thing.
Maybe so.
But also it is that sense of I do feel like I have a feeling of what it was like, where it was just lonely and isolated. My father would talk about, there are a lot of mosquitoes during the night, and so, a lot of bites, from the mosquitoes, or the way that, they fed the children and how they're malnourished, and we didn't have diapers, we had rags. The cribs were all painted in lead paint, so if the kid was sucking on that paint, they get lead poisoning. So things like
Mhm.
that, where you again hear those stories, and it's not a very nice picture to hear about that. And then later in life, when I was around 18, my parents recommended that I read an article that was from one of the human rights groups about the orphanage I was at. And that painted a huge picture about child abuse that was happening there, or, you know, other things like that, where you just go, oh my, right again, right? Oh my goodness, like that is terrible. Like, I don't like that. And therefore it contributed to that. I don't like being Chinese. If that's what Chinese people do to their kids, I don't know. I'm not part of that. So
Yeah.
yeah, definitely added to the narrative.
Do you know if you were anonymously dropped off?
In the records, it says that they didn't find any birth parents or anyone claiming me on that end. So yes, and I think there was no like documentation or a blanket or anything to say, hey, this was from your birth family. That's also associated. So
Yeah. So you were probably with your mother or somebody in your family for a month and then
yeah, and I did a little bit of research, talking to other Chinese people, and they said that's kind of typical in a sense because the first month is kind of that critical moment for a mother to be with her child and taking care of it, and then so I was told that sometimes that is normal for a child to be a month old when they're out is because of the traditional practices they have.
Oh, okay. All right.
So
Wow.
then your parents adopt you with all your 5 siblings, and where do you come back to the US? Where do you land?
Yeah, so I like to say that I was bloom where I was transplanted versus bloom where I was planted because we moved a lot. So
I
when I
like that.
came back to America, we lived in Massachusetts for 2 years. Then we lived in Indiana for 9 years. Then my dad's
Mm,
headquarters for one of his jobs was in Paris, France. So I had to go to Paris, France for 4 years. And then I went back to the US for school. I took a semester off to live in Buffalo, New York. And then I went to Ball State University for college. And
mhm,
then I was raised Mormon. So I went on a Mormon mission to Vancouver, BC for 18 months before going back to Utah to live with close to my family for a bit. Then I moved to Delaware for a few years. And then I went to graduate school in Denver, Colorado. And then I came
mm.
here in Portland.
A lot of changes. Are you still Mormon?
No, I am
I
not. I left the
wondered.
church about 2 or 3 years ago.
That's big
That
too.
it explains a lot though, the
Yeah.
5 children and then
Yes, it
it's
does.
all kind of falling into place. Also,
Yeah.
wow, being in the orphanage, adopted, and then moved around
Right.
so much. You must be an incredibly resilient person.
Hmm.
I like that word. I like that word, resilient. Definitely adaptable. And I think it
Hmm.
definitely attributes to a lot of the adoptee kind of mindset of just
Hmm.
the best way to survive is to adapt. And if you can't do that, you know,
Yeah.
there's fear of abandonment, there's fear of, being not enough. And so I definitely kind of had to keep up that image for sure. Yeah.
And
How
how
was it?
was it in your family? Oh, sorry, Louise. I was just
No,
wondering,
same question.
how was it in your family uh, growing up? How was that for you?
Yeah. I think it was hard because I was listening to, one of your podcasts earlier, and it's that mindset of, right, we're treating you like the same. You will be like all the other kids, we'll
Hmm.
love you the same. It'll be very easy. And I think the reality is it wasn't easy, because it was something that I noticed very, very quickly when I was younger, that I was different and I didn't understand that difference. And so it complicated a lot of things, whether it was my emotions, whether in certain situations where, punishment was a different mindset for me, like to be punished, you did something wrong. But for me, it adds, that aggravation of like, oh, I could get abandoned for this, or there's going to be
Hmm.
Mm.
those consequences that make me not, a good person. And so that black and white thinking was very quickly established, where you're either good or you're bad. And then, of course, having those multiple layers of the church that I belonged to was all about perfection as well. And so you're definitely putting a lot more pressure on yourself than maybe the natural child would,
Yeah.
because you're trying to prove, I think, yourself in many areas. And the fact that my parents also had, very strict um, ideals of what their kids were going to be, whether it's healthy, a very, a certain weight, or whether they have to get education or they have to be committed in their church. And so to have that, on yourself all the time, I think it became almost a moment where I started living for others because that's the only way you can survive. And so it
Yeah.
became a very active part of who I am, is that I live for other people, because we don't get that opportunity, I think, to really live for ourselves because of that lack of identity towards
Yeah.
oneself. And so I think that was really difficult. Um, and,
And lonely.
and
Yeah.
lonely, yeah,
Very lonely.
definitely. And then especially for me, when I was around 9 years old, I was sexually assaulted by a sibling. And
Oh
I think that
no.
just added to the
Ugh.
confusion of like, I was adopted into a family that I'm assuming was supposed to love me, but then this happened. And the fact that, I didn't, get the help I needed when it happened was really difficult. And
Did you
it
tell
Were
some?
the parents aware of it?
yes. So when it happened, after, a few weeks, I was having issues where I had to go to a gynecologist, and they're like, this is really weird, she's 9, she shouldn't be having this issue. And that's when I kind of, addressed the situation. And for my parents, and I'm not sure if it's the religious ideologies or just that we have so many kids, it's hard to really pinpoint. But I remember my parents asking me, like, hey, do you want therapy for this? Like, do you want to get help? And I was like, I don't understand what happened. I know
You
what
were 9. I
I was
mean,
9.
gosh.
Yeah.
And so for them, they took that as, okay, you don't need help because you
Oh
didn't ask
boy.
for it. And so I said, oh, okay. So, but it did create this mistrust, right? That attachment situation. And again, I remember hearing that from a recent podcast of yours where it's the question is like, do we really bond with the family that we're with when we're adopted, or
Yes.
we'll attach with what we can. And for me, that was that connect of like, okay, like I have a family. They're according to the Mormon Church, they're my forever family. Like I'll be dead, and they'll be connected to me when I'm dead too. And so it was kind of confusing to have that fear of like, I don't trust this family, but I'm stuck with them. So here I am.
Soraya, did they protect you after that from the sibling?
No. I would
Mm.
say that again, I don't know again if it's because they weren't, and I think, as I said, it's hard when you have 6 kids. Like I think
Mm-hmm.
you hear about people who have one kid, they can put all that attention on one child. But I think because they had 6 kids, everyone had different situations, everyone had different issues. And so sadly for that sibling, they fell in the cracks. And to this day, they're struggling now because probably they didn't get the help that they needed. But it is that situation where I think many of us in our family have, taken that time to find therapy, have taken that time to
Right.
heal from those situations. And that's what I've been trying to do on my end, is heal from those memories and those experiences.
It's
Are you
big.
are you in touch with with that family now?
No, but I do get to hear updates about them. So, that's kind of where it
Yeah.
is.
That's a whole strength on its own to sever
Yes.
that relationship. It's not easy. So,
No, and especially for myself too, it is something that, I've always struggled with, is the idea of, what is family, and for me,
Right.
I grew up with knowing that my family was a very huge central part, and that's I think the center of, the Mormon faith is your family. And so having to go, hey, I need to make boundaries, I need to create those things to help myself, was hard because, for many people it'd be
Yeah.
like, hey, that's your sibling. Like, why would you do that? And it's like, because I need to. So
And leaving the Mormon church is no small thing. I've had 3 friends do it.
no, I was not.
It's not easy.
And I think that definitely helped me get out of that fog too, because again, I was so focused in an organization that was all about getting to heaven, making sure you're doing all the right things, paying your tithing, going to church, going to the temple, all these different, you know, expectations
Yeah.
that I think.
paying your tithing, okay? There that this is the crux of of everything, isn't it? When it comes to organized religion.
Right. And so yeah, it takes away from any other identity that you might want to connect with. And so I think when I was able to leave, it was able to give me an opportunity to say, okay, now I can start understanding what it meant to be, what it means to be adopted, what it means to be, Chinese, what it means to just be
Yeah.
myself without these expectations following me or dragging me down.
You're very strong. That's very, because you're young. That's a lot, to be
Thank
on your
you.
own doing all of this. Have you done a lot of searching? Have you found anything out about your past?
Yeah, so that was one thing too that I also decided to do, which I didn't want to do prior. And again, it's because the way I grew up was the whole, hey, in heaven you'll meet your birth parents, so it's okay, whatever, we'll do it later. But for me, it was like, hey, I mean, I have an opportunity now that maybe I didn't think I had before, and so I did take it. And it's really hard, I think, especially again, I think when you're in that healing process, because a lot of the times I think when we do find adoptive friends, they all have different experiences. And so you have to
Hmm.
carry that along with yours and trying not to be judgmental, or not being like, hey, that's unfair that you found your parents and I can't, or things like that. So for me, it's been difficult, but it's also been beautiful in the sense that my significant other, I think, says it best, where it's you just have to take things at your own speed, at your own time. Because if you try to, force, like, I want to find my
Yeah.
birth parents in one year, you're going to be disappointed. And I think and I felt that before, where it's like, okay, I'm putting my DNA in, or I'm sending my blood sample to China, or I'm doing these things that are the right things, quote unquote.
Hmm.
But it still is going to take that time, and still can feel that disappointment, even though you're like, okay, don't expect things. But it's been fun to be able to kind of learn the different technologies, especially knowing that they'll continue to be growing as well.
Yeah.
But I was able to find a potential second cousin of mine
Mm.
through one of my DNA searches. And he currently lives in Australia. And so we finally connected and we've messaged and video called now. So it's kind of nice to feel like I do have a
Yeah.
relative out there, but it is still that like hope that I can find possible more. Because the way that I like to tell people is I don't want to search for my birth parents particularly, but I do think it's important to see if I can find my birth family in some aspects. So
Yeah. It's very
I'm
grounding, I think.
yeah.
I'm curious. I'm going to back up just a bit. At what point did you walk away from your adoptive family, and did you stop? When did you stop living with them, and then when did you
Mm.
stop contact with them?
Yeah. So I think I'd say probably during my grad school, I started figuring out how to do things for myself. So that was a couple years ago. So that was hard because like, again, I had to in my mind, I had to make sure I left for the right reasons instead of just leaving because I don't want to be here versus, hey, there's reasons that I have on my end.
Yeah.
And I think also as I was working on coming out as well, and so there's just a lot of different layers to figure out. And again, that fear of punishment, even though I'm an adult, like that just fear of like if I do this, my parents are gonna yell at me or they're gonna cut me off or something. I know those just natural fears I think made it hard. But as I saw myself making decisions like, hey, I'm not gonna rush doing my grad program. I'm not going to do this, I think helped me go, hey, I have more control. And
Mm-hmm.
then I think at least with my family members, again, it's about boundaries and learning like, hey, maybe when you say these things, maybe I need to show you what happens if you say this and saying that hurts or that doesn't feel good. And I think there was a point where, I wrote my mother a letter about telling her all the things that she had done wrong as a parent and kind of that feeling like I need to feel justified and why I feel this
Yeah.
way. Um, and then I think by having that letter out there, I was able to share that. And then I was able to say, hey, I'm going to take a break because I just keep getting hurt. Every time I talk to you, I have a panic attack. Every time this happens, I'm having negative responses. And I need to take that opportunity to say no anymore. So I remember I think I took about 3 months off talking to my mother. And I think that was a big wake up call for them in the sense that, hey, my child's not hugging me all the time. It's difficult. But then it helped, I think, establish like, hey, I have boundaries and I want them to be respected. And I think
Yeah.
that's definitely been done with other family members as well. I currently talk to my mother once in a while and a little bit with my father, but again, it's the boundaries. Like if, for example, my father is talking about how wonderful his life is and all that without his kids and things like that, then like, hey, that's what you want to do. That's the limit that we have then with our relationship. So I think that's been very helpful, learning that you can do that. And realizing as an adult too, that I'm learning there's not a negative consequence. I'm not going to get,
Yeah.
spanked or whipped because I didn't talk to my mother, one day or something like that. So again, it's just this slow process, but something that I'm finding valuable in allowing me to heal and allowing me to, as someone would say, living my true self, living my
Yeah.
authentic self.
Has
You-
anybody been supportive in your family? Anybody like reached out and said, "Listen, I'm here with you," or
Yeah, I was able to connect with one of my siblings that I unfortunately lost connection with because my mother kind of got in the way of our
Mm.
relationship. And so it was like many years ago. And so I finally reached out to them like, hey, I haven't talked to you. I don't even know where we're at with our relationship. And I think we were able to reconcile like, hey, all the, that we've realized that, relationship was tainted because misinformation or that disconnect of something. And so now that we're able to connect again, we're able to have that relationship that I've missed out on. So it's been nice to have that connection. And then I think as I've gotten older, because when I was younger too, I've been able to better connect with my sister as well. It's still difficult with her at times, but at least I have her as well. So I usually just talk to her and the other sibling more than all the other family members.
Mm.
Now, what kind of when did you start your search for your family
Mhm.
in relation to when you kind of came out of the fog during COVID?
Mm-hmm.
Um, That's a good question. I think it was when I can I think it was when I realized I can make my own choices. Again, it's that there's a weird feeling about being in a heavily religious organization
Mhm.
that, suppresses so much out of you,
Yeah.
where they make every excuse for you not to do something, right? You have an eternal family. Why would you like to find your birth family? Or, you have an eternal family. Why do you want to look for more? I mean, shouldn't you be grateful, right? Shouldn't you be happy
Right.
where you're at? Aren't you so lucky to have been
Mhm.
adopted?
The
And I
same
think,
old, same old.
yeah,
Yeah.
Continues through the generations and the years. It never goes away.
Nope.
yeah, I was just talking to my grandpa too. We were like, I just forget that you're adopted sometimes. I'm like, oh, okay. I understand the sentiment, but
He's colorblind.
Yeah.
yeah, well, yeah, but I think it was the opportunity of, again, being able to make choices for yourself, being able to say, hey, I'd like to make a choice, or saying, hey, maybe I wasn't satisfied with the idea of not finding my birth parents. Maybe I do want to find that. What does that look like?
Mhm.
And I think a long time ago, I did get the ancestry DNA opportunity, and I think for Asians, I think 23andMe is more ideal than Ancestry DNA. So I remember doing that for myself. So it was those little steps, right? And again,
Yeah.
making little steps is what I think gets you to those big successes. And I think people forget that. Because right, we're looking, I think, at a huge picture of like, okay, here's all the things I need to do to find my birth family versus, hey, let's start with one piece first. How do you get there?
Yeah.
And so by giving them the acknowledgement of, hey, that's what I want to do, here's what I'm doing. And then as I went slowly there, that question of, hey, parents, I'm doing this. Would you like to support me, or would you not like to support me? And if it's not, then okay. And now I know that it's just something I'll do myself. And so I think it is, taking those moments of doing things, but then also saying, all right, we did that. You can do other things, or you can take a break, work on the things, and things come back. And I think that's what I've noticed a lot is when I
Mhm.
don't focus or obsess over, the search of my birth family, that's when those opportunities arise a lot for me. And so that's been amazing to know that, taking that slow moment. And yes, you're going to see stories about people who find their birth family before you. Yes, you're going to see, movies about, children, meeting their birth family. But for me, it's about the journey. And I think that's what's allowed me to be who I am right now and allow me to feel good about where I'm at instead of feeling like I'm a failure at not finding my
Of
family, because
course.
I'm taking that time.
And
Did
also you talked about community. Do you have adoptee community? Because you said you have adopted friends.
Yeah, so that was one of the biggest things that happened when I left the church and I left um, Colorado and went to Oregon, was that I was very adamant to find my adoptee community, and I have found some good friends as well as amazing communities that are well focused for BIPOC adoptees. And so that's allowed me to, again, feel less alone, feel like I have people to talk to.
Um,
I have one good friend who works for a post-adoption, group, and I never knew there's post-adoption stuff. So this is great. And so yeah, you definitely have a great community, and of course, you're picking people who you want to be your chosen family almost, which is a
Mhm.
Yeah.
beautiful feeling. So whether, I do have adopted friends, whether I have white friends, I have found a way to let them be part of that, chosen family that have noticed, that, hey, you're an adoptee, but we accept you, or hey, we noticed that, you're struggling in these areas, and right, we'll be there for you versus, hey, you should be grateful, or I don't know why you want to search for your family, right? It's a very supportive group,
Yeah.
which is very different from how I grew up, where it's very much the last thing to think about for yourself.
Have you met Angela
Yes.
Tucker? She's in Portland and she
Yeah,
has the Adoptee Mentoring Society and she wrote a book we read
yes,
last season.
yeah,
Yes.
I heard that one. No, I have not met her. Unless she's been one of our guests at one of our groups, the Adopting Mosaic or the
Oh,
BIPOC Adoptees
yeah.
group, and maybe, but it does sound familiar. And I did listen to her podcast for sure.
Yeah.
When I wanted to ask or maybe muse about, I think, you were in such chaos, right? You went
Yeah.
from a chaotic situation in the orphanage into what can only be described as a chaotic family and lonely and feeling different than. It I think some of that distorts from the original trauma, right? So it
Right.
does take time to then get to original trauma. I need to pause for 1 second. So that sort of secondary trauma can sometimes muddle the path of
Mhm.
getting to our true selves. And so the fact that you have been able to get there is pretty incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's hard too because I mean I've spent time, with therapists. I spent time in a mental institute when I was younger, and so I mean, it definitely was hard too to figure out why was I feeling this way. Because again, I was struggling a lot with my mental health
Yeah.
from the time I was 9, or maybe till the
Right,
time
of
I was a
course.
baby. But till then, I didn't know I didn't know where it came from. I was like, I just feel this feeling. I feel
Hmm.
like I'm not good enough. I feel like all these things. I'm not sure it is, which caused anxiety, depression. These moments. And I think as I highlighted about my mission, so as Mormons, women can
Yeah.
choose to go on a mission or not. So I chose because I'd always wanted to go on one, but was called to, British Columbia, Vancouver, but the struggle wasn't that. It was that I had to speak Mandarin Chinese there. And that's
Oh,
where that trauma was like, that's the last people I want to talk to about anything. And for me, like I said, it was a short-lived experience in Vancouver. I mean, I finished my mission as a volunteer missionary in Utah,
mhm.
but it was because I couldn't handle it. I didn't know why. It was just too much to learn the languages, too much for me to be interacting with them, and to the point where, I was on the verge of ending my life there, and that's why I had to
Mm.
come back. But it's hard because no one explains to you that feeling.
What's
Because again,
happening?
right, people want you to feel like, hey, I chose you, and I love you, and that's all that's needed to make
Hmm.
you feel wanted. And for me, it didn't feel that way.
Well, it's weird, you're Chinese and yet you're in a culture where you're not in the culture.
Mm.
And then
Yeah,
you're thinking you haven't had any help in understanding your culture and you're pushed up against it. So you haven't been to China, I'm guessing.
we tried when I was 18, but my mom forgot that you needed a visa to go to China,
Oh,
so we did not have that
yeah.
opportunity. But yeah, you're right. I mean, you're in a religion too that's very white based, where
Hmm.
everything is
Yeah.
like when you're
Very.
adopted into the family, you go through something called a sealing, in the temple.
Right.
It's like, hey, it doesn't matter where you are anymore because now you're sealed. Or when you're a teenager or mid adult age, you get something called a patriarchal blessing where you're put into a tribe of Israel. And so again, it's that reassurance that, hey, you're meant to be in this community, but we're not, recognizing, your
Right.
ethnicity. And the only thing you know about ethnicity is either the Native Americans, maybe, or that blacks didn't get the history till in the 1960s. And it's just like, okay, like this is very odd that we have these
Yeah.
bits and pieces, but again, there's just not much talked about, other than that. And so, it doesn't come up in culture. It just comes up that you're doing the right thing as a member of that faith.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you have so
Ugh,
much there.
I
I'm so glad you're starting at this age and not, 20, 30 years down the line
me
when
too.
things are kind of entrenched. And you said you have a partner, so that that's great. I know it could be attachment is really hard for adoptees
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
who had a wonderful childhood. I can't imagine, I can't imagine. What am I saying? But having all that secondary and triple trauma
Yeah.
that now you have somebody that is,
And what that's nice about them as well is that they took the time to understand those things. So especially when I first started dating them, I was somewhat active in the church, and so they had to understand, like, what does that mean to be Mormon? So taking that time to research that, or hey, this person's an adoptee, what does that mean? And so I think for somebody I meant to take that time to try to understand you, than just like, okay, you're just some cute Asian that I'm dating, this is good.
Right.
Hey, no, I understand. Okay, now when I do this, I now know why you're feeling that way. Or, hey, again, if you're going to do this adoption search, I'm going to be there and supportive, but as well as, being protective. And so it's been a very positive experience. Even though like every other once in a while, I still have those fears of like, oh no, what if I'm still not good enough? but
Of course, to be honest, you probably always have that. We have that, and you've had, like Sarah said, many infractions along the way,
Mhm.
right? To keep feeling that. But I think just 32 and you're like doing this, it's so hopeful that you turned it around. And a lot of people don't. I mean, so many people lose their lives to this. This is the
Mm-hmm.
truth, you
And you
know?
And
were
that's
close, it sounds like,
Yeah,
no, yeah, I struggle, and that's one of the things that I do struggle with. It's called, I guess the technical term is SI, or suicidal ID.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yeah.
hard.
mm-hmm,
And that's
mm-hmm.
a scary thing again, because it's like, why do I feel that way? But maybe there's a reason why you feel that way. Um, but again, it's about being able to see the light, or be able to know, again, it takes time and it's a journey. And I do appreciate every time you say that that I'm doing great for a 32-year-old, because in my brain, I'm still like, I've met younger people who are, in reunion, or I've met younger people who are advocates who, have their own organizations. Like, I'm nothing compared to that. So it's always like, okay, thank you. But no, I
No,
do.
just the fact that
And
you are
yeah,
here and telling your
Mm-hmm.
story and doing the work to feel
yeah,
better and to reading the books and doing all this stuff, that's, you really, the odds were stacked against you
They
from
were.
day one, and here you are. So it really is, it's hard.
Mhm.
It's hard, and we'll probably always feel that
Mhm.
gaping hole inside. And I mean, there's not
Yeah,
much that we can do to change that except just keep doing what we're doing.
right. Moving
And
forward.
and you are in the younger group. I mean, they are more out there and talking
Yeah.
about it and everything, but from our wisdom older perspective here, you're doing really well. I mean, you have to know because you can't compare your journey.
Right.
And look at us. We came out on the podcast, at 50 plus, right? So you're doing great. You have such a big life ahead. It's exciting, you know.
And I'm glad you have a second cousin you're talking to,
Me
because
too.
that'll get you closer and closer. And
Mhm. Mhm.
well, will you please keep us
Yeah.
informed? We're talking about starting a little follow-up series
Yeah,
in our podcast, just a little, little pod bites, maybe once a month with follow-ups. And you would be one we'd love to have come back
for
to
sure.
tell us what,
Yeah,
your updates on your journey and all that. And
that'd be great. Thank you. Yeah, no, I love sharing my story, and again, I think just being able to have it out there, I think is is most important. I think a lot of
hmm
people, when they're trying to figure themselves out, it can be consuming for sure. And for me, I've had those moments, but I've also, again, it's been what, 3 years since I've been on this journey, and it's just like I couldn't imagine it being any better than it is. The way that I've been
Yeah.
able to take that time and being able to, just tell my story through other podcasts, post it on my social medias, or, being able to be in these different communities and having people hear you and go, yeah, that makes sense. And you're all right. Yeah.
And you don't know
yeah,
whose life you're saving. I mean,
Mm,
honestly, there might be someone who listens that's the episode that helped them, right?
mm,
That's the
yeah.
truth. So,
amen. Thank you, Sariah. Really enjoyed talking to you, and thank you
me
for coming
too.
on.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.